questionnaire B on one piece of paper. I want you to work in pairs. So what you're going to do, as soon as you get your piece of paper, you're going to rip it in half. So fold it and into two pieces. So rip it in half so that you each get a questionnaire. One of you gets questionnaire A, and the other one gets questionnaire B. And then take a few minutes to fill out, but not on this paper, because I do not want you to share. There's some very sensitive information here. I do not want you to share your data. I don't want to see your data. I just want you to go through the process of actually having to fill out one of these questionnaires, because that will help you in the next piece of this activity. So we're going to hand these out, 2 per person, 1 per 2 people. So you 2 are now in a pair. And then split it up and, split it up and start working. So you 2, can you move back a seat or two rows? And you 2 can fill it out together. I'll do this side. Can you work with, and you 2 work together? And you 2 work together? Can you 2? And so take a separate piece of paper, of your own paper, to fill the survey out with. Can you 2 work together? And, well, there's an odd number of people on this side. So can I get, actually, could you work with someone over there? Okay. And you guys figure out how, there's 2 for the 4 of you, how you're going to all work together. And how about you come over here? How about you 2 work together? Here, you 2 can work together. There you go. There you go. Do you get everybody? Oh, I'm sorry, you ran out of paper. Okay, so take a few minutes to fill out the survey, but remember, do not write it on the same sheet. Oh, so some of you have something called recap. You got the wrong thing. Okay, raise your hand if you got this recap. Yeah, it's fine.
Oh, I guess I'll keep it too then.
Oh. Well, anyway, who's supposedly working together? You guys?
Yeah.
Did you get... Sorry, some of you got a recap. Okay. Anybody else? So does everybody have an actual survey? Questionnaire A, questionnaire B at the top. No, yeah. She wants to keep it, that's fine. Those who got the recap want to keep it. I don't know how that happened. But is this you? So is anybody not paired back here? No? Well, have a seat. And here's your partner right here, or a couple of them. So split this in half. You do questionnaire A and give questionnaire B to him. Okay? And you answer the questions, but not on this piece of paper. So if somebody else comes in, why don't we'll have them share this with you. Answer the questions, but do not put your answers on the paper. Oh, okay, thanks.
Is that okay? I mean, I already transferred.
Oh, that's fine. I just don't want you to share your information, so that's fine. right, now that you've had a chance to fill it out, some of you in the back might still be working on it. I want you to get together with whoever has the other half of your sheet of paper. And I want you to go through question by question and compare the questions and how you answered them. So they were question 1 on questionnaire A matches with question 1 on questionnaire B. And so I'd like you to sort of read them to each other, discuss the differences, and how you think the differences might affect your answer, your response to that question. Okay? And then once you've had a chance to discuss all 8 of them, you each have 8 questions, then we'll go through and have a whole class discussion about questionnaire design and what things to avoid when you're designing a questionnaire. No, I don't want you to share your answers. I just want you to read, each of you read your questions and talk about how the difference between the 2 questions could affect how you would answer it.
Would you say that most men that men are increasing that women are better suited than men? Do you agree with Barack Obama saying that? Just words.
Here you go. Yeah.
You practice same sex?
There was in the 60s. So what do you think is the difference between those 2 questions?
I was just using your words very carefully. I was just using your words carefully.
Right, but what about the last one, question 8?
The one about the Nazis or the one about the car?
No, the car. The car and the sex.
I'm assuming that people with cars have more sex.
I wasn't thinking about in that direction. But if you were asked, do you practice safe sex, versus if you were asked, do you own a car?
One of them is sort of an obvious answer.
Right.
There's a judgment associated with one answer.
Right, that's right. And what else? There's also sort of all sorts of moral issues associated with one that people might not want to admit what's going on with one versus the other. You know, are you willing to share your answer with Warren about your sex question, right? As opposed to, he wouldn't have any problem sharing his answer. Well, right. Well, you can imagine not everybody would be, whereas the car one seems kind of relatively safe. Oh, sorry. Anybody need one?
Sorry for being late.
That's okay. Yeah, I'll take it.
Oh, I have no
Oh,
doubt.
yeah. All right, let's hear what your conversations are about these two questionnaires. So remember when we're going to talk about these 8 questions, and I do not want to hear your answer, okay? I just want to hear how you think the 2 questions are different from each other and might elicit a more accurate response than the other one, or do you think they're equally the same? What do you see as the difference between them? So question 1 says, now I'm reduced to only recap. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? Men are better suited emotionally for politics than are most women. That's question. I don't remember which questionnaire had that. And then the other one is, would you say that most men are better suited emotionally for politics than are most women, that men and women are equally suited, or that women are better suited than men in this area? So they seem like nearly identical questions. So what do you think? How do you think? Do you see a difference between those two? Yes?
In the first question, you're giving 2 options, agree or disagree. But in the second question, the second set, you're given 3 options, which will give you a little bit better, or a little bit more of a variance between answers.
That's right. In the first question, you either agree or disagree. In the second question, you actually have 3 options. There is a sort of neutral option.
Yeah,
Yes?
I was going to say that it gives you what the reader's opinion really, or the answer's opinion really is. Like, you could say...
Well, which one do you think you already...
Second one gives you more information on the
This,
first.
where do you see more information?
Because you can say that women are better, men are equal, or that they're better suited just versus yes or no.
Right. So in a way, you're actually picking one of these that you would agree with as opposed to agree or disagree. Yes, in the back?
Also, the first question asks men are better suited versus the second one is most men are better suited.
That's true. And the other is the first one has one direction, right? And it's that men are better suited than women. And then you either agree or disagree. So you don't get to see the sort of the flip side of it. The other thing is there have been lots of psychology experiments in terms of how people answer these kinds of questions. And we, as a sort of human race, tend to be really agreeable and want to agree with things. And we even go so far as to agree with statements like this when we don't actually really agree with statements like this. So when you're asked, do you agree or disagree with something, people sort of want to agree with you. And so option 2, that has 3 different options in it, allows the person to pick which one it is that they feel they agree with, as opposed to simply wanting to agree with the person who's asking the question. So there have been experiments where they also ask the flip side, do you agree or disagree that women are better suited emotionally for politics? And people will, in fact, flip their answers. They agree with both statements when that's not really possible to agree with both statements. All right, next question. Do you agree with Barack Obama's $1 billion bailout of the banking industry? Do you agree with the $1 billion plan to rescue the banking industry? What do you think? Yes?
Well, the one with Barack Obama kind of gives people a heuristic, so they might not necessarily deliberate the decision of the $1 billion plan, but they might give an answer, do I like Barack Obama?
Very good. So the one with Barack Obama actually, that's called double-barreled, meaning there's sort of 2 things going on here. One is that people might, in fact, have a strong positive or negative reaction when they hear Barack Obama's name, and in fact they're responding to that as opposed to the actual question. Yes?
Well, no, I was just saying, I don't know if this is I know bailout versus rescue.
Very, very important difference. The choice of wording here, bailout versus rescue, is definitely would skew could possibly skew the response. Bailout has a negative connotation to it. Rescue has a positive connotation. Yes? That's what you're going to say? So wording choice can really affect or bias the possible answer. And bringing in another topic, such as Barack Obama, can also affect the answer. Okay, did you yourself... Yes?
For the last one, is there a better term than either bailout or rescue in order to really get at what
Well, that's the questionnaire survey design is really hard in that you do want to pick very neutral ways of asking questions. Off the top of my head, I don't know, I'd turn it over to you and say, and so in fact what happens with lots of survey design is that they pilot test it first on small groups and then refine their questions, right? Did you yourself happen to attend church in the last 7 days? How interested would you say you are in religion? Very interested, somewhat interested, not very interested. So you probably have noticed already that both groups, whether you had questionnaire A or questionnaire B, had these two questions. So what was the difference between questionnaire A and questionnaire B? In the back? That's right. So it was the order of the questions. So ordering of the questions can actually matter in terms of the kind of response you get. It's been determined that if you ask first before I tell you this, what's the basic difference between those two questions? They're both trying to get at similar kinds of information. Yeah? A yes or no answer for which? So that's right, but even more, say more than that. Yes, the first one is yes or no, and? Yeah?
I don't know if this is a question, but I feel like the first one kind of say yes, then that means like you're very interested, say no, and then
If you say, well, it's true that we might infer something about your interest in religion depending on whether or not you went to church in the past 7 days. But how else are these two questions different from each other? Yeah? So before we get there, you're comparing what would happen with the order. I just want to simply ask, what's the difference between those two questions? Yeah? That's exactly right. The first one's a fact. Did you or did you not go to church and in the past 7 days? And so maybe that's what the person who said it's a yes or no was thinking. But this is a question where either you did or you didn't attend church in the past 7 days, whereas the second question, how interested would you say you are in religion? That is more of a statement about your interests. And there could be how interested I am, whether I'm very interested or somewhat interested is up to sort of my personal interpretation. So now I'll get to what you were saying, Adrian, which is, so what about the difference in the order? So it's been shown that people actually respond more accurately to the did you attend church in the past 7 days if you first start it with how interested are you in religion. So as opposed to the other way around. Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say they lie. But it might be that focuses them more on religion first, and then they recall whether or not they went to church. We're going to get to lying soon. Okay, compare these two. It is estimated that disposable diapers account for less than 2% of the trash in today's landfills. In contrast, beverage containers, third-class mail, and yard waste are estimated to account for about 21% of trash in landfills. Given this, in your opinion, would it be fair to tax or ban disposable diapers? That's one long question. Do you support, oppose, or are neutral about a tax on disposable diapers to offset the environmental cost? How about you guys in the back on the right? What do you think? right, I'll switch over to the left. Yes. The first question gives you a lot of information, yes? So you think that this would bias you towards saying no because of the information they chose to give you is information that compares the sheer quantity of waste, as opposed to what other kind of information would someone who wants to bias you in the other direction, what information might they give you? Yeah? Right, they could talk about what happens to the water, the pollution in the water. They could also talk about how long does it take for the diapers to actually decompose and no longer, be a problem. Yes?
You could also change the measurement.
Change the right to
To make it seem very large and then not necessarily give the other information.
right. So there are other metrics that you could probably use to compare the pollution caused by diapers versus disposable diapers versus these other kinds of pollution. So adding all of this extra information, in fact, sort of steers people to answer the question in a particular way. Okay, were you the victim of a crime in the last 12 months? Were you the victim of a crime in the last 6 months? There's a really obvious difference between these two questions. But how might you think that the difference between those, what might lead to slightly less accurate estimates? Yeah? The longer amount of time, yes? The harder it is to remember. That's exactly right. Studies have shown that people have a hard time remembering things that happened more than 6 months ago. Another thing is that we tend to do what's called telescoping, which is that when some possibly important or traumatic event in our life happened, it's like it happened yesterday. And so when we're asked a question like in the past year, something that might have happened a year and a half ago gets all of a sudden to be within the past year. And so when we're asked about events happening within a certain time frame, we tend to telescope. In other words, bring in events that happened even longer ago. And that's probably more likely to happen when it's 12 months versus 6 months. Yes?
People have a tendency of, their memory just sort of makes things up. And so
The longer since the event, you fill in the details that might not have actually been there.
So
Right.
was I a victim of a crime in the past 12 months? I really have to think about it. Well, was I? But in the past 6 months, you probably don't hallucinate.
Right. You're not having to generate memories. Right. Yes?
Also a problem how people will look at the word crime.
Yes, that's a very good point. The definition of the word crime is not clear here. And so we'd want to be much more precise about what kind of crime. Right. Very good point. The next one, rather than actually showing you the two questions, I want to show you those were in fact questions on a survey in 1993. The survey was conducted in the previous fall, and the survey results were released on the day before the Holocaust Memorial was opened in Washington, D.C. And it said the news in the New York Times said, the story title said, 1 in 5 in new survey expressed some doubt about the Holocaust. And it says right here at the bottom, you probably can't read it in the back, it says, does it seem possible or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? What do you have to say about the difference between these two questions? Yeah? That's exactly it. The double negative can make it really hard for you to interpret what is being asked of you. If you say yes or no or impossible, are you agreeing with that statement? Are you countering that statement? And it can be quite confusing. And so it was a shock at that time that 22% of adult respondents to the survey said that it seemed possible that the Holocaust never happened. And then an additional 12% said that they were not sure. So between those two, 22 and 12, there was a huge fraction of the adult population in the U.S. either said it was possible it never happened, or they weren't sure whether or not it happened. So this was a big enough deal that a year later, they conducted another survey and changed the wording, and that's the wording in the other question that you all had. And if you see, I don't think this one actually has the wording. Can somebody read the wording to me? I don't have it. Yes?
Does it seem possible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened, or do you feel certain that it happened?
So does it seem possible that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened, or
Do you feel certain that it happened?
do you feel certain that it happened? So again, the difference now is you're being given two options, and you're choosing between those two options. And when given that question, 2% or less said that it seemed possible that the Holocaust never happened. That's a very big difference from 22%. So that gives you an example of how very biased, we shall say, that a survey question might be in measuring the outcome or measuring the information that you want to in fact be measuring. So this guy, Tom W. Smith of the University of Chicago National Opinion Research Center, analyzed both Roper polls and said there's an additional, wait, where is it? I guess he doesn't say anything too interesting right here, but he's, later on we'll show you another opinion of his. All right, so the very last one, these two are not at all comparable in the sense of they're not asking similar questions, but what do you think, why do you think I put those two questions together? Do you own a car? Do you practice safe sex? Yeah?
Well, the first one is a yes or no answer, and the second one, even though it seems like yes or no answer, is contingent on the fact that you're having sex in the first place.
That's true, but you could say not having sex is practicing safe sex, but but they both, yes, they both have sort of yes or no answers, but what else? Yeah? The second one's more fuzzy. People define it differently, yeah? Right? So what else? Yes?
I feel like people are way more likely to lie about the second one.
They're way more likely to lie about the second one because you know what you're supposed to say, right? You know what you're supposed to say, and there's a huge issue, can be, of saying whether or not you practice safe sex if you don't, because you know you're supposed to. And so that can lead to people lying about their responses. And so there are ways that survey designers have created to get people to answer these kinds of highly sensitive questions more accurately. But even if we say, a lot of you have pointed out that the first one is far more clear. And you could even say, I don't know how many of you answered this question, half of you had it, but did any of you answer it those of you who own a car, when in fact you don't actually own the car, your parent owns the car? Or you don't actually own a car, you own an SUV or a truck. So even a simple question like, do you own a car, can have some amount of ambiguity in it, because you might think, oh, well, there's a car in my family and I'm the one driving it. Yes, I own the car. Or, yeah, I own a car, but it's an SUV, and technically an SUV is actually more of a truck than a car. All right, so in summary, questionnaire design. Survey respondents tend to give answers that they think you expect them to give. So they're more likely to, in fact, agree with a statement that you're giving them the option to agree or disagree. They're more likely to agree even when they actually disagree. Suggestive wording of key questions, which we've sort of seen already, are leading questions, can produce skewed results. And the diaper one is a very good example of such a thing. Confusing wording can bias the results, and it's important to keep the question wording very simple and very clear. The Holocaust question is a very good example of it, as well as sort of double negatives in there. Subjects tend to telescope events into the time period that are asked about. That's were you a victim in the past 6 months or 12 months? and subjects tend not to be able to recall accurately more than 6 months ago. Double-barreled questions, such as the Obama bank bailout, refer to two potentially controversial topics and may be eliciting a response to the wrong topic. In other words, eliciting a response about Obama rather than a response about the bank bailout/rescue. Question order can matter. Where a general question is asked first, followed by a specific question, tends to produce more accurate results than vice versa. People lie about sex, drug use, and other kinds of issues, and so you have to be quite careful about asking a question where they feel safe in order that their confidentiality of their response will not be revealed in asking questions about things like that. The other thing we haven't quite talked about so far is what are called closed question versus open question. Some of you have brought that up. A closed question gives you a list of possible answers, whereas an open question is something like, how do you feel about blah? And your answer is very free-form or open. So when we're designing surveys, we often start with open questions to sort of see what possible answers people might give. And then in the final finished product that we apply to our more rigorously taken sample, we use more closed questions, which provide a set of possible answers. So I want you to think about the survey or the questionnaire as a measurement device. It's an instrument. So in a way, this questionnaire that I asked you to fill out, this terms team survey, is an instrument. And you take measurements with that instrument. And so a poorly designed question can lead to bias in your measurement, just like when we talked before about measuring things with, weight or blood pressure or whatever, and there's measurement error, and possibly bias. We can get bias here with poorly designed instruments. Bias meaning you think you're getting the answer to this particular question, but in fact you're getting the answer to a different question because of the way you've asked it, the wording you've chosen, the options you've given, etc. All right. Now we're going to talk a little more about sex. Women in Love was a third publication of Cher Hite in 1987. She surveyed 4,500 women about love and sex. And when some of the questions she asked were demographic questions, such as your income level, where do you live, your race. On the left-hand side, this one column is the proportion or percentage of the respondents belonging to each of these income brackets. And on the right-hand side is the U.S. population. And so you can see that it actually matches up very well in terms of, we just pick any one of these, $6,000 to $8,000 a year income. 10% of the study population versus 9.7% of the U.S. population. As you go down, it's pretty well aligned. Similarly, where do people live? Large city, urban area, 60%. My rural and small town got a little confused. That's 27% and 26% with a difference of 1%. The small towns, 13 and 12. And then the race, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, are also very well aligned. All right, so those are typically ways that we look at the sample that we've taken and we compare it to the population of interest, and when they match up by these sorts of demographic things, that leads us to think, hey, this is a pretty representative sample. So here are some of the responses that she was publishing in her book of her survey respondents. 69% say, these are all women, 69% of the women say that men seem confused by falling in love. 87% say it's difficult to meet men they admire and respect. 98% say that they want to make basic changes in their relationships. And 70% of the women who are married for 5 or more years are having sex outside their marriage. Well, that might be depressing. What's another reaction? For the single men? Okay. No? How about a different reaction? How did she pick the people to be in her sample? Good question. Yes? Did you see? In fact, I can. Very good. Now that we've just talked about questionnaire design, can you want to say, can I see what questions they were actually answering? Another good question. Yes?
How basic changes are there?
Yeah. In other words, yeah. How big is this basic change? Right? Is it that? Well, yes. Right. I was just going to. Never mind. We don't want to get into my personal situation. Okay. So the other studies, if we compare this to other studies, the Harris poll, same year, says that 89% say that their relationship with their partner is satisfying. This same person, Tom Smith of the National Opinion Research Center, says any question that gets an answer of 98%, which is nearly 100%, is either a wrong question or wrongly phrased. So you get that now, right? So they're saying there's no way 100% of the people would answer a question the same way. And the last one, there are several different polls, some from the 60s and others from the 80s. And then past this point, this book was under quite a lot of debate for many years, and into the 90s, all had that estimate of the percent who are married who have had an affair or having an affair, which is even more broadly based than the question that the Height report was answering, is 25 to 30%. That's really different. So here are three issues raised by other polls or pollsters about the Height report and this Height survey. You asked about questionnaire design, what went wrong? For those of you who raised the issue of questionnaire, the words of "in love" were used a lot, and that can mean different things to different people in particular situations as well. There were leading questions such as, does your husband or lover see you as an equal, or are there times when he treats you as an inferior, leave you out of decisions, act superior? What do you think of those options? Yes?
In a way, they're kind of suggesting an answer.
Yeah, they definitely are suggesting an answer. They're giving you 4 different ways in which men are treating you like crap, and only one way in which you're seen as an equal, as opposed to, what about the other way when you're held up on the pedestal? That one's not there. Yes?
If you ask someone, have you ever had an experience where X happens? You probably have. And so answering yes to this question is very likely, especially given that have you ever had any of the following kinds of
Well, that's a good point. Or are there times when this happens? And there might have been, you're right. Yes, there might have been a time or a few times or whatever, and you worked it out, right? Or
Has there been a time that I've been to Oakland? Yes. Does that mean I live in Oakland?
no. And the other thing is there were 127 essay questions. So these were all basically, or many open-ended questions on this. With several different parts. So that leads you to think, who is filling out these surveys? So that goes on to the issue that another one of you have raised is the issue of selection bias. So who got the surveys? These questionnaires were mailed to organizations of women's organizations, professional women's groups, counseling centers, church societies. They were all women's groups. So what? What difference? Yeah? If it's a counseling center, you're probably getting women who are going through some sort of turmoil and very likely with a relationship. And those that are dissatisfied might be much more likely to fill in that questionnaire and return it. There's no control. Any women, well, any of these women who get it can then choose to return it. So it's completely self-selected. So you know about that issue about sort of bias being introduced in terms of, is this a representative group of women for the United States? They sent out 100,000 questionnaires. And although getting back or studying 4,500 is a very large sample, you'll see in survey design, that's a large sample, but not when it's a 4.5% return rate on 100,000 questionnaires. It's not just the more that you survey, the better your responses and your projections or inferences will be. It really matters that you get a well-represented sample, and that doesn't have to be a huge sample. In fact, sending out lots of questionnaires to only a subset of the population and then allowing them to decide whether or not to send them back can lead to non-response and self-selection bias that could really make an impact, as we've seen, on the answers to this survey. So here's a way to think about the design of the survey. So there's the target population. So this is a Venn diagram of sorts. And those are all U.S. women. That's what we'd like to be making statements about. But then there's how do we reach the women? We're reaching them through women's groups. So that's what we call our sampling frame. That's the other piece. And there's an intersection of those two. And that intersection is what we call the sampled population. And those are the women who belong to a women's group and took the time to complete the survey. Then there are all those other women who don't belong to the intersection but are in the target population. And those are the women who are not belonging to these women's group. They're not going to a counseling center or a church group or whatever. There are people who belong to the sampling frame that aren't in the target population. And those might be girls or men that are in these groups. And then there's this other piece here, which are women in the target population who are in the sampling frame, but are not part of the sample population. And that's our non-respondents. They could be people who did not fill it out or did not receive the questionnaire, even though they belong to those groups. So ideally, there's the sampling frame and the target population entirely overlap. Practically, that almost never happens. You need a way to reach out to your population, and that's your sampling frame. And it's great if you can have the potential to reach everybody in your target population, but that's often not the case. So I want to go back and take a look at this and now introduce some terms. There's the observation unit, which is also known as an element. That's the basic unit on which you want to take the measurements. Remember, our instrument is a survey. We're taking measurements by getting them to respond. That's your observation unit. That is a woman in the United States in 1987 or so. There's the target population, which is the complete collection of all the observation units that you are studying. That's all U.S. women. And there's a sample, just a general sample. That's some subset of that target population. Okay. Then there's the sampled population, the sampling unit, and the sampling frame. The sampled population, that's, if we go back up, if you remember, that's that intersection between the sampling frame and the actual target population. So that's the collection of all possible observation units that you can reach, that can be chosen for the sample. So those in the height example are the U.S. women who belong to a women's group. They received the questionnaire and they filled it out and returned it. The sampling unit is not necessarily the same as an observation unit. In the height example, they're not the same. The sampling unit is the women's group, the organization, the church group, the counseling center. Those are the sampling units, different from the observation unit. The observation unit is the individual woman that I would wish to observe. The sampling unit is how do I go about trying to reach her. I reach her through these women's groups. And the sampling frame is just the list of all these sampling units. So now I'm just going to back up and show you this again. So the observation units are all the women that are in this box on the left-hand side. The sampling units are all the women's groups that are in the sampling frame that I'm using to reach the women. Okay? The sample will be some subset inside this sampled population. The sampled population has all the people that might be in the actual sample that I take. So the word sample gets used in lots of different ways, so you have to be kind of careful when you're talking about it. Last thing, I just wanted to, since, Election Day is coming up, I want to encourage you all to vote. And what better time to talk about surveys than now when there are all sorts of polls going on. And so I just briefly, is the latest in the California governor's race, the latest field poll shows that Brown has a 10-point lead. Here's the website, 538, and their forecasts. And you can see that they've been taking polls since last February, and you can sort of see how things have been changing. The question might be, how do they reach these people? What kind of questions do they ask? What's going on with these samples? They use 538 made its name just in the last presidential election by using simulation to, in fact, try to simulate all possible events that might be happening and make forecasts, and they were the most accurate of all the other predictors of the presidential election. And here's one simulation, and you can read about how it's based on 100,000 simulations with random variation in the local and national political environment. And this is their estimate of the probability that Brown versus Whitman will win the gubernatorial race. So the stuff that you're doing now with your simulations and what we're talking about polls is directly related to the way current statistics is being used. Cutting edge. All right, have a good weekend. Don't forget to turn your team surveys in.